Thank you for listening to the Tattness podcast on the Tattness Co. Network.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. A Mercedes kind of sentiment, luxury, and trust in me to honor the free we all should be. It seems my sundial burst into yin and yang, right and left me.
What is up, my Tattness podcast family? You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for all the support. I'm going to give you something special. This show is going to be long and it's lengthy, trust me, but it's so worth it. This guest is somebody that's going to fascinate you, I think. The stories are unreal. My guest is none other than Howard Bloom. Howard was the P.R.Rep for people like Michael Jackson, Prince, Aerosmith, Billy Idol, Cyndi Lauper, and just hundreds and hundreds of others. And the stories he has. I don't know if you guys are anything like me, if you're a rock fan and you like rock and metal. I used to love a certain magazine that you might be surprised as to who was the editor for it. Circus Magazine, if you remember those, that, you know, always featured bands that you dig. It was cool, man. I was a huge collector. This man was the editor for that magazine in its incarnation, so that's really cool. And he's got a lot of other stories. You'll have to listen to it. Check it out. All right. So how's it going?
Absolutely terrific. I've got this new book out, Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, A Search for Soul in the Power Pits of Rock and Roll. And the reviews have been astonishing. Absolutely astonishing.
No doubt. I mean, that is fascinating in and of itself. Like, the second you hear that, you're like, I need to read this. You know?
Well, but the strange thing about the reviews is this is my rock and roll memoir. But it's more than just a rock and roll memoir. I was on a hunt for something from the age of 12 on. The ecstatic experience, the experience of being lifted out of yourself and into something higher than yourself, bigger than yourself, and how that fits into the forces of history. And that's despite the fact that my background is science. I got involved in microbiology and theoretical physics at the age of 10. And by the time I was 12, I was compiling my first scientific credentials. I co-designed a computer that won some science fair awards, and I built my first Boolean algebra machine, and I was schlepped off for a meeting with the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo. We spent an hour discussing Big Bang versus steady state theory of the universe and the interpretation of the Doppler shift. And he came, I'm 12, imagine this.
You know.
And he comes out of his office and he puts his hand on my shoulder and he says to my mom, "You don't have to save for grad school for him. He'll get fellowships in theoretical physics at any university he wants." So, and I was tutored, given private lessons in outside the box science by the guy who was head of research and development for the company that made the valves for the first plane to fly faster than the speed of sound and the first plane to fly to the edge of space. So this is all while I was 12. But at 12, I became very aware that there was this ecstatic aspect to experience. How I became aware of it, I have no idea. And because science is about, when I was 10, the thing that turned me on to science was a book. The book appeared in my lap in my big living room one day. It's one of those books where you don't know the location of the book. You know the location of every single book your parents own, because it's always been in the same place. And in this case, it was a book that had never been there before. And I opened it up, and it said the first two rules of science are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And it gave the example of Galileo, and it said he was willing to go to the stake to defend his truth. It took me 30 years to find out that wasn't true, but I needed the heroic version of the story. And number two, rule of science number 2, look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Well, the gods inside of us, the ecstatic experiences, are right behind our nose. And if it's the obligation of science to look at everything under our noses, then it's the obligation to look at everything behind our noses. And that becomes something important, a mystery that science should be able somehow to explain. So I went off on the track of that and graduated from NYU, magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa. The head of the graduate physics department had been right. He was just wrong about the subject. I had fellowships at 4 different grad schools in neuroscience. And I suddenly realized if I go to grad school, that's going to be Auschwitz for the mind. Here I am here I am on the track of the ecstatic experience, and there's no way in hell I'm ever going to find that by giving paper and pencil tests to 22 college students in exchange for a psychology credit. I mean, how many ecstatic experiences are you going to see in that room? Zero. So a strange accident has happened to me. Poetry was extremely important to me, not just science. Well, let's go back to the origins of that strange accident. Again, when I was 12, one day a girl in my 8th grade class turned her eyes in my direction. And that had never happened to me before. And then she did something even more startling. She made eye contact. And she told me, I told my mom that you understand the theory of relativity. Now, look, the only thing I had going for me, the kids in my hometown, Buffalo, didn't want to have anything to do with me. And my parents didn't want to have anything to do with me. So the only thing I had going for me was that the kids called me the sickly scientist. So I dare not let down my reputation. So as soon as school was out, I jumped on my bicycle. I pedaled to the local library where the librarians knew me better than my mother did. I said, give me everything you've got on relativity. They shoved a great big fat book across the desk at me and a little tiny skinny book. The big fat book was by Einstein and 2 collaborators. It was all mathematical equations with 7 words of English per page. But I had learned that if you put yourself through the really hard thing, if you take the hardest path to everything, you go through a book and you don't think you understood it. By the time you finished it, you've understood something. So I started with the big fat book, and 8 o'clock at night arrived. I've been doing this for almost 4 hours. And I suddenly realized my mom's going to put me to sleep at 10 o'clock. I still don't understand the theory of relativity. I'm only 50 pages into this 350-page book. Maybe I better turn to the little skinny book. So I opened the little skinny book, which was by Einstein himself. And it was as if, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, it's as if the author reaches out from the page and grabs you by the shirt and puts his nose up to yours and says, schmuck, listen up. To be a genius, it's not enough to come up with a theory only 7 men in the world can understand. To be a genius, you have to be able to come up with that theory and then explain it so clearly that anyone with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it. In other words, Einstein had told me to be an original scientific thinker, which is the only thing available to me, the only thing I wanted. You have to be a writer, and not just any writer. You have to be an exquisite writer. You have to be a delicious writer. You have to be a writer who turns everything into a mystery story where people can't wait to get to the end. So, and poetry became extremely important to me, extremely important. So I was taking a poetry class from the poet in residence at NYU, and one day he said, Bloom, wait until everybody leaves the classroom, close the door, sit there. And he pointed at the bowling out chair. This did not sound good. So I waited until everybody left. I closed the door. I sat down in the bowling out seat, and he said, look, you, last year I asked you to be on the staff of the literary magazine. You never even showed up. This year, I'm telling you, you are the editor of the literary magazine. You don't even have a faculty advisor. The minute you walk out that door, you are the literary magazine. Now walk out that door. So I walked out the door and I looked puzzled as hell because I hated literary magazines. You know, they have these pale blue robin's egg color covers and they have this typeface that's so bad that it's absolutely ridiculous. And so if you throw a literary magazine into a room that has a roaring orgy, within 5 minutes, that room will empty out. They're so boring. So I looked extremely confused, and a kid walking down the corridor, who I didn't know, said, you look disturbed about something. Can I help you? And I explained, yes, I've just been named the editor of the literary magazine. And he invited me down for a cup of coffee. Now, because I had not grown up among other humans, I didn't know what the ritual of have a cup of coffee really meant. So I followed him to a coffee shop, and I ordered a glass of water, and he ordered a cup of coffee. And he asked me one of the most important questions I've ever been asked, which is, if you could do anything you want with this magazine, what would it be? And I blurted out a picture book. So I recruited a team of artists, along with the team of literary people, and we won 2 National Academy of Poets prizes, and we caused an absolute smash in the art community in New York City, in the commercial art community. I had calls, I'm a college student, for God's sakes. and I'm getting calls from the art director at Look Magazine, the art director at the Evergreen Review, which was the leading bohemian magazine in the world at the time, and from the art director of Boy's Life, the Boy Scout, great big glossy full color magazine. So I had a chance, instead of going to grad school, to start an art studio with the artists that I had pulled together. I mean, it happened a little like this. One day, it was the beginning of the summer, I had tried to kill myself. Look, it was for 4 years I had had a purpose in life. It was to get straight A's. And for the first 2 semesters, I failed. I got 3 A's and a B. And then I realized that my teachers really didn't want me to know what was in the textbook. They wanted me to know what was in their class notes because they wanted me to parrot their ideas. And once I learned that simple lesson about ego, it was straight A's for 3 years, nothing but A's. And now all of a sudden I had no purpose in life. I had no structure for my life. So I made a half-hearted attempt at suicide. I would later do a much more serious attempt at suicide, but these are, you learn from these experiences. So my wife had me committed to a mental institution because of the suicide attempt. And it was 2 very, very interesting weeks in the mental institution. I learned all kinds of amazing things. And then when they let me out, I went over to the apartment of the most brilliant of the artists that I had recruited. And the room was empty. There was no furniture. His wife, his 3-year-old, and he were sitting on the floor, and they were all crying, all 3 of them. And I asked them what was wrong. And he said, well, our furniture has been repossessed, hence the empty room. Our telephone's being cut off, our electricity is being cut off, and we're about to be evicted from our apartment. And I said, but man, your work is absolutely brilliant. If anybody sees it, they're going to hire you. Give me your work, put it in a portfolio. I will take it out for 2 weeks because I haven't got a summer job yet. And in 2 weeks, I'll have enough work for you to pay your rent, and then I can find a summer job. Well, he said, okay, but I came to New York to found an art studio, and I came with this friend of mine, and you have to take his work out too. His friend's work was nauseating. It wasn't art. It was terrible. But I said yes, and we started a commercial art studio. And I never made it to grad school because I saw this as a periscope position to find the ecstatic experience, to find the gods inside, to find the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made. So I did that for 3 years. And then we did some amazing things. I invented a new animation technique for NBC TV. I made it on the cover of Art Direction magazine, which is ridiculous. I hadn't come from the world of art at all. And we did all of the graphics for ABC 7 FM stations when they were doing a really risky transition. They were going from top 40 to this brand new format that had been cooked up by a bunch of hippies at a place called Bard College, which is like hippie central. And they were going to try it on 7 FM stations all at once, all across the country. And it was called progressive radio, album radio, rock radio. In other words, if you were a DJ, up until now, you could only play the songs basically in the top 20. And now you could play anything you wanted, even an entire album, if that's what you wanted to do. So we did all the graphics for those 7 stations in their transition. And they asked me to create an ad agency to represent them. And I didn't want to learn time buying because it's boring. And I didn't want to get involved with the boredom of that stuff. So I turned them down. And then there was the guy named Matty Simmons. And Matty Simmons had helped create something brand new for a company called American Express. The new invention was called the credit card. Wow. And he had made a fortune. And now that he had a fortune, he wanted to be a magazine publisher. So there was this magazine these kids in Harvard used to put out once a year, and it would go on newsstands all over North America, and it would sell out within 2 hours. So he flew up to Boston. He found the kids who were doing the magazine that year. He sat down 2 of them. He said, look, why don't you come to Manhattan? I'll give you a lot of money. We'll put you up in very, very fancy apartments. You'll live the life of kings, but you have to turn out this magazine not once a year, but once a month. And the magazine from Harvard was called the Harvard Lampoon. So the new magazine was called The National Lampoon. And because Maddie treated me as if I were his son, and because I had this fantastic artist who had come into the studio much later on, and I had brought in, despite the fact none of the artists wanted him, they saw him as competition. But his work was great. He had done the whole ABC FM campaign. And so Maddie hired my art studio to do the art direction. Well, remember the artist whose work I was forced to carry around even though I thought his work was nauseating? Okay, he convinced half of the members of the studio to throw me out. The reasoning went like this. We're getting this great big fat check every month now from the National Lampoon. Why do we need Howard? If we throw him out, we can take his percentage and divide it up between ourselves. So they threw me out of the studio, and meanwhile, I had wanted to write for magazines. I had written already scientific stuff for the head of the Middlesex County Mental Health Clinic in New Jersey. And I had put together his reports on scientific symposia and all kinds of stuff like that. But in order to reach the kind of mass audience that Einstein implied to me, I needed to get into magazines. That's where I could reach a really mass audience. And so one day, so I used to co-design my clothing with a designer down on the Lower East Side. And so the clothes I wore didn't bear any relationship to clothes you've ever seen on planet Earth before. So there was a new magazine. It was an underground fashion magazine. It was called Rags. It was being bankrolled by Baron Woolman, who had bankrolled another little magazine called Rolling Stone. And it was in the garment district. So I took a freight elevator, that's all there was in the building, up to the 4th floor where the offices of this magazine, Rags, were. And I expected to take my portfolio, put it on a table, and the 3 girls, the 3 editors who were there, would ooh and ah over the pictures. And that didn't happen. Instead, they saw my clothes, their jaws dropped. They said, "Do you have more of these?" And I said, "Yeah, I've got a whole closet full of them." "Why?" They said, "Do you think you could write an article on them?" Well, hey, you know, that's what I've been looking for a long time. So I wrote the article, and they made me a contributing editor, and I wrote another 175 articles for them. And then another one of their contributing editors decided to start a new magazine called Natural Lifestyles, and she made me a contributing editor to that. So I'd just been thrown out of my art studio, and I was getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning, going naked to a Remington manual typewriter, which the kind of typewriter where you had to hit each key with a sledgehammer to get it to operate. And I was typing from 6 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock in the morning, and then putting on my clothes and going into the art studio, and then coming home at night and sitting there at the typewriter again until 11 o'clock at night with a pot of coffee. And I was getting tired.
No doubt.
This was wearing me down. So I was covering a parapsychology convention one day, just after I'd been thrown out of my own art studio, and somebody saw the fact that I had a notepad that seemed like a growth on my left hand. It never left my left hand, and I was constantly taking notes, and he figured I was a journalist, and he walked up to me and said, "Would you like to edit a magazine?" And I thought, wow, if I could edit a magazine, I could do my writing during the day, and I wouldn't have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Beautiful.
So I said yes, and he gave me a name and an address and a time. Now, okay, you've got to remember, back in those days, we didn't have any Google. This is the 1970s.
Right.
So if you had the name of a person that you were going to meet today, you'd Google him and find out all about him, and you'd know what his magazine was. But we couldn't do that in those days. So I went into this meeting cold, and he told me the name of the magazine was Circus. And I thought, okay, clowns and elephants. I could, if necessary, I could write about that. It's not my favorite thing in the world. And he said, no, it's about rock and roll. So that's how I got into the rock and roll business. I mean, he didn't care what my credentials were, not at all. He was desperate. There were two, across the hall, there was a converted broom closet, and there were 2 guys packing their stuff in that converted broom closet. His 2 editors had just quit. And all he wanted to know was, can you give me a finished magazine in 2 weeks? Well, I had edited the Washington Square Review, and, I had stood over the printing presses until 4 a.m. watching the inking on the rollers on every single copy of that magazine to make sure that every copy would turn out gorgeous. I had learned all kinds of things. I had never put out a monthly magazine before, but sometimes you know something and you don't know why you know it. So the answer was, yes, I can give you a magazine in 2 weeks. That's all he cared about. The fact that I listened to Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, Bartok, Stravinsky, and had never listened to rock and roll, that didn't matter to him.
I love that because my fans probably don't know this, but anyone that knows me personally knows that back in the day, I was the biggest collector of Circus Magazine.
Astonishing.
I had the posters all over all my walls.
Amazing.
I bought them religiously. Every time one came out, it was that and Hit Parader. I spent all my money on both.
Oh, yes.
And I bought them all throughout the 90s and everything. Like, I had to have them. That was what I spent my money on.
Amazing. Well, here's how Circus and Hit Parader got to be what they were when you were collecting them. Jerry Rothberg, the publisher of Circus, threw me a challenge. He said, look, first of all, I want the magazine to read like Time. Okay, I read Time from cover to cover. I had since I was 14 years old. And my best friend and I always tied for first place in the Time magazine current events quiz every year. So Time was not, there's a big difference between just reading a magazine and dissecting it so that you can imitate it. But still, I was into what he was talking about. But he also said, there are these 2 magazines in Europe. One is called Bravo, that's in Germany. One is called Salut les copains, that's in France. And each of those magazines sells 1 million copies. Well, each of those markets is a fifth the size of the United States, which means theoretically, if a magazine were to sell an equivalent number of copies in the United States, it would sell 5 million magazines. How do I achieve the success of these 2 European magazines? So I spent a year dissecting Time magazine as if it were a frog on a lab bench, and dissecting Salut les copains and Bravo. And then I came back to Jerry about 10 months later, and I said, look, I know you've got a rule against covering any group more than once in a year, but I'm going to give you a new magazine format, and I guarantee you it will sell magazines. And he let me run with it, and it changed things dramatically. We had an A-list, and that A-list person, whoever that was, we would cover him every month, every single month. And we would cover his life as an unfolding soap opera. So at the end of each story, you wondered what was going to happen to him next. And we had a B-list, people who appeared every other month, and a C-list of people who we were just trying out to see if we got any audience response. And I took a trick from Salut les copains. And the trick was they had a top 20 in the magazine. And under the top 20, there was a ballot. And you could vote for your 5 favorite artists. So you could goose your favorite artist up that chart. Yeah. And if you were really enthusiastic about that artist, you could buy 5 copies of the magazine and send in 5 ballots. So we did a top 20 like that, and we put a ballot at the bottom. And now I had a measure of what my audience was interested in. And it turned out that my audience was twice as interested in one artist than it was in any other artist. And that one artist was Alice Cooper. And the next artist in line, who got half the number of votes consistently that Alice Cooper got, was David Bowie.
Wow.
Both acts that wore dresses, by the way. David Bowie in England, before he broke big in the United States, was wearing dresses. That was his shock statement. So I covered Alice Cooper every single month, and the result was, and David Bowie every other month. And the result of the new format and the new style, the new writing style, was we went up 211% in circulation in 12 months. And then after I left Circus, Jerry eventually, I wrote him a 57-page booklet on how to turn out Circus Magazine. I found the guy who would be my successor, the next editor. I trained him for 6 months. So I left Jerry in a very good position to put out this magazine. But 2 years later or something like that, maybe it was 3, Jerry got bored with that format, and he tried changing formats, and it didn't work. And Jerry, when I had been working with him, when I first started with him, he was a man of modest means. He had an apartment on 2nd Avenue around 62nd Street, a modest apartment. Of course, living in anywhere in Manhattan is extremely expensive. Well, halfway into the magazine, once we started getting money for this dramatic increase in circulation, Jerry moved to an aircraft hangar-sized apartment overlooking the river on the east side, an astonishing place. Wow. So Jerry, when he abandoned the formula, went into Chapter 11. Meanwhile, bankruptcy. Meanwhile, I was miffed. My ego was hurt that he had abandoned that formula, because I had worked every day from 8 in the morning until 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night to do all this work for him. And I felt abandoned. So Shelton Ivany from Hit Parader called and said, could we get together for lunch? And I said, sure. And I gave him the whole formula. And he applied it. And I got a call from Barry Kramer, the founder of Cream. And he said, I'm coming in from Detroit. Can we get together for lunch? And I said, sure. And I gave him the whole formula. And then one day I got this big manila envelope by messenger from one of the founding editors of Rolling Stone, Chet Flippo, who founded Rolling Stone's East Coast office. And it had 6 pages in it. Chet was writing his master's thesis at the University of Texas in Austin on the history of rock and roll journalism. And I wondered why he's sending me these 6 pages by messenger, which is really expensive. So I take them out of the manila folder and I start reading them. And they're about some little munchkin in a converted broom closet, working away like Rumpelstiltskin, turning straw into gold. And inventing, he said that whoever this person was had created an entirely new magazine genre, the heavy metal magazine. And it turned out those 6 pages were about me. Wow. So those magazines that you collected so assiduously were based on the formula that I had created for Jerry Rothberg to try to give him the magazine of his dreams.
And that's what I loved about it. Is like, I liked Hit Parader a lot, but Circus had its elements that were so different. And what I loved is they stuck with exactly what you're saying. And I don't know if anyone that's listening is 100% familiar, but it's like whatever band was just killing it at the time.
Right.
Typically every month on the cover, which is what kept me buying it.
Right.
Always someone that was my favorite anyway. And
right.
What they may not know is on the inside cover was a calendar. The inside of the cover was a calendar of somebody's band for that month. So it was a month-long calendar.
Right.
That had the bottom half was the month dates, but the top half was a picture of someone from that band. And I thought that was creative. And the fact that they stuck with, okay, this is who's killing it right now.
Right.
Why change it? You could add people and bands that are starting to come up to the cover, but the focus was on the primary, you know.
Well, that's what I did. And I had to learn how to predict 4 months in advance what albums would be on the top of the charts, which is a tricky proposition.
Oh yeah.
I had a fight with the record company people because they kept their release schedules secret. And I had to convince them that if they wanted to get in Circus, they were going to have to reveal their release schedules to me so I could predict which of those albums was going to go high on the charts. And I discovered I was doing all this using correlational studies, you know, stuff straight out of my science background. And what I discovered is bands weren't popular because they had hit records. They weren't popular because they had hit songs. They were popular because they'd gone out and toured. And in the process of going out and touring is magic. Touring is where the gods are. Touring is where those ecstatic experiences happen. And they happen with the artist on stage, and they happen with the audience. And once that has happened, you have a bond to that band that you just won't forget. And you tell other people about that band. So you start a word of mouth about that band based on your personal passions. And so what I looked for was not a band that was going to have a hit single. It was a band that was touring. And I looked at the previous chart position of the bands. So it was an interesting process. And look, I never had a teenagehood. When I was 16 years old, I was working at the world's largest cancer research facility and coming up with a theory of the beginning, middle, and end of the universe that predicted something that wouldn't be discovered for 38 years called dark energy. So I never had a teenagehood. And through this magazine, I was able to vicariously live teenagedom. Because my audience, I looked at the ages of my audience. The average age was 16 and a half, and I had to appeal to those 16 and a half-year-old kids. So it's like Michael Jackson, who would become my client eventually. Michael never had a childhood. He never had a childhood either. And because he never had a childhood, he was ferociously dedicated to kids. Those were his most important audience, because those are the people living out the childhood that he had never had. And by loving those kids, and I don't mean sexually, I mean just loving those kids, loving to startle them, surprise them, awe them, delight them, because Michael had this uncanny ability, beyond human ability, for awe, wonder, and surprise himself. And he felt that was a gift from God to him. And because God had given him that gift, it was his job to give that gift to his kids.
Right. Like he valued what they have that he doesn't and wanted to contribute to that. Right. You know, and I mean, I could, psychology wise, I would imagine there's that need to, as like a people pleaser in that regard of like, you get to have what I didn't have. Instead of being bitter, I'm going to contribute to what you have and make it right for you.
Right.
You know, people see dollar signs and then they make accusations and all that nonsense. And, you know.
No, Michael was in it sheerly to pass along that delight, awe, and wonder to his kids.
And I think that's
dollars were not on his mind.
No, it's the parents that made the accusations that saw money. And they want you, like, you're going to naturally want those accusations to disappear. And for the right price, you know, we'll make them disappear. There's a bunch of vultures that I think.
Well, that's it. I mean, let me tell you an experience with Billy Joel. We haven't gotten up to my being involved with all these people yet, but we'll skip a little bit for a second. One day, Billy loves his motorcycles. One day, he was motorcycling out on Long Island where he lives, and he was coming at 40 miles an hour, the speed limit, toward a green light. So what do you do on a green light? Do you stop or do you go through it?
Right.
You go through it, right? Which means that the driver coming perpendicular to you has a red light and is going to stop, right? Well, Billy's barreling down the highway, is coming toward this intersection. He has a green light. There is a car that does not stop at the red light, a car perpendicular to him. And that car tries to make a left turn. And Billy puts on the brakes, but he's much too close to that car for the brakes to do any good. And he slams into the car, and he flies over the car and lands on the other side. And the driver, it's a 27-year-old woman, gets out, and she is in a state of panic. She thinks she has killed whoever this anonymous guy is. And she runs over to try to help him, and he's medevaced to Lenox Hill Hospital. And the woman must have gone to an attorney. And the attorney must have said something like, okay, yeah, the accident was your fault. No, I'm sorry, the accident was not your fault. He hit you, right? So the accident was his fault. And here's why. You didn't just have an accident with anybody. You had an accident with a superstar.
Right.
And he is not going to want to see negative headlines about himself. So if you sue him for hitting you, he is going to settle out of court to keep this out of the headlines.
Right.
And it's a cool $250,000. Now, I know that today in the entertainment industry, $250,000 is pocket change. But in those days, the 1980s, it was big money. Well, Billy almost lost the use of his right hand. Now, imagine that. Billy, in his song Piano Man, is telling you what he enjoys most in life, being in front of an audience and banging on those keys. If he lost his right hand, not only would he lose the ability to do what he enjoys the most and is most talented at, we would lose a national treasure. Nonetheless, it shows you how people think when they have a possibility of making money off of a superstar. So the first woman to make sexual accusations against Michael Jackson got $23 million.
So now more people are going to be like, oh, it works.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
And I've said that all the time, like, it's so blatant, you know?
Right. And there are women who are troubled, who, because they've had troubled marriages, they're troubled people to begin with. Their marriages have been troubled. They're now single. They're living a troubled life. They have difficulty making money. And if their kids are fortunate enough to become friends with Michael, well, at first they welcome it. They think it's the most amazing thing in the world. It gives them bragging rights.
Right.
And then they realize there's money.
Right.
There.
Then the agenda forms, and
right.
You know, someone who's so innocent-minded is not even going to think somebody has an agenda here, or I'm putting myself in a position where somebody could clean me out, you know, and...
Exactly, because Michael, okay, remember back to your own childhood when you had your first sleepover with friends, and how wildly exciting it was, and how you couldn't stop talking until dawn? Okay, well, that's what Michael was doing with those kids who stayed overnight. Another thing to realize is Michael Jackson's bedroom was not a private place. You and I are so used to privacy in our bedrooms, we take that for granted. Lionel Richie was another client of mine. And Lionel explained that when he and Michael were going to do the song We Are the World, you know, for this huge charity event, that Lionel went to Michael's bedroom. They lay on the carpet on the floor, and they were tossing lyrics back and forth. And all of a sudden, Lionel felt something eyeing him from the level of his eyes, and he's down there laying on the floor. I mean, this is a very strange height at which to be eyeing you from eye level. And he turned his head very slowly to his right, and there was Muscles, Michael's boa constrictor.
Oh, geez.
Sizing him up as a potential lunch. So that's what Michael's bedroom was, a public place. And it's very hard for us to get used to that idea of a bedroom as a public place. But that was it. I mean, it was a safe space because it was basically public. So, and Michael, again, because he had no childhood, he was suffering from childhood deprivation. One of my friends, who unfortunately died a few years ago, Jaak Panksepp, is the world's greatest researcher on emotion. And he took a bunch of rats, baby rats, and he kept them from playing. Baby rats play, just like baby puppies play. And when they're playing, they establish the dominance hierarchies that are going to last them for the rest of their life. But they have a ball doing it. Right. And they squeak and they squeal and they make all these noises that you have to use a special microphone to hear. Well, then when the puppies had passed their childhood, he put them back in the cage with the other rats. And they were suffering from play deprivation. They played as much in their adulthood as they would have played in their childhood if they had been allowed to. So Michael was suffering from childhood deprivation, and I was suffering from teenage deprivation. And that turned out to the advantage of both of our audiences. And you were part of not my audience because I was gone by then, but the format that I had developed stuck around, continued to be important. So at any rate, so there I was editing Circus Magazine, and I had never worked for anybody in my life. And I was a year and a half into it, 18 months into it. And Jerry Rothberg, my publisher, came to me and said, "Don't you think it's about time I gave you a raise?" And I suddenly remembered, oh, raises. I guess that's part of the normal business world. And I had no idea what to ask for in a raise. So I called my friends from Rags Magazine. And when Rags had folded, they had gone to really important places. Vogue, one of them had co-founded a magazine with Gloria Steinem called Ms. And I called them and said, how much should I ask for in a raise? And they said, well, tell me what you do. So I told them what I did. And remember, I had replaced 2 people. And when I left, they would replace me with 5 people.
Wow.
So I described it, and they said, well, you need a 60% raise. So I went to Jerry, and I said, I proposed a 60% raise, and he said he couldn't afford it. Now think of this. If he was going to have to replace me with many people, it was going to cost him a hell of a lot more.
Right.
But
basic math.
But nonetheless, he said, no, I can't afford that. So I gave him 6 months' notice to rescue my dignity. And that's when I found Steve Gaines, the guy who I trained to be editor of Circus Magazine for 6 months. And that's when I wrote the 57-page book on how to turn out the circus format. And I went looking for a job. And one day, Steve Gaines said to me, there's a guy I want you to meet. And he introduced me to Seymour Stein. Seymour Stein was the founder of Sire Records. And Sire Records had Echo and the Bunnymen and Eno and Climax Blues Band and Renaissance in those days. And Seymour was the guy who would eventually sign, see if you've heard of this one, Madonna.
Yeah, you know?
Yeah, right. So Seymour sort of adopted me. And he had a wife named Linda. I had a wife named Linda. And he used to have me come up to his apartment on 74th Street overlooking the park, or was it 74th Street in Central Park West, I guess. And it was on the 4th floor, so it overlooked the tops of the trees. And it was huge. It was absolutely huge. And he had this massive living room, bigger than a studio apartment. And Linda and I, my wife, would sit there on a couch. The room was basically empty. It was empty with one couch. It had one little table with a telephone on it next to the windows and a tiny little chair. And then it had these very strange looking things against the walls. And I had time because Seymour would keep me waiting for a half an hour. And so I went over to these stacks of whatever they were up against the walls, and I pulled one of them back. Now, do you know what Art Nouveau is?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Art Nouveau was huge in the 1970s. Yeah. Absolutely huge. Anybody who lived in the Village or had ever wanted to live in the Village had Art Nouveau posters on their walls. And the Art Nouveau poster that was universal, that everybody had, was a poster by a guy named Mucha. So I pull this thing, whatever it is, back, and look, and on the other side, there's a painting. It's a canvas stretched over a framework of wood. Mm-hmm. And it's the Mucha that everybody had on their walls, but this is the original. Wow. And Seymour had stacks of these, dozens of these, up against his wall with their backs, with their fronts turned to the wall, so you couldn't even see them.
Good Lord.
And Seymour would come in, and he would sit on that tiny little chair next to the tiny little table that had the telephone on it, and the conversations would go something like this. You know that piece that's going on sale tomorrow at Sotheby's? It's this Art Nouveau sculpture of a nude young woman. It's selling for $18,000. Buy it. In 2 years, it's going to be worth $36,000. Now, we're talking figures closer to $100,000 and $150,000 today.
Oh, yeah.
So I always wondered who he was talking to. And it turned out that there was this kid who was a T-boy in England at a music publishing company called Dick James Music. And the kid, a T-boy, is a gopher. And Seymour, when he'd been at Dick James Music visiting, had made friends with this kid. And then this kid, well, I'll tell you another story. So I did get a little bit of education. Remember, I was running the art studio, right?
Right.
And we were doing stuff we were doing all the advertising for ABC's 7FM stations in this massive transition to progressive radio. So I used to go up there often, and the head of promotion took me under her wing and decided to educate me about this thing I didn't know anything about called rock and roll. And one day she said, we're having a live concert in Studio B. And if I give you 2 tickets, will you come? So I said yes. And I brought with me my brilliant artist, the one who'd been on the floor with his wife and his 3-year-old all crying. And there was a piano player on stage. And my artist embarrassed the hell out of me because he stood through the entire concert. He whooped, he hollered, he whistled. He embarrassed, everybody was going to know he was with me. There was no way I could pretend he wasn't. And the piano player did a terrific performance. And they turned that album, they turned that recording into a live album, and you can still hear it on radio today. And the piano player was Elton John.
Wow.
And it took me years to realize in my own performances, I look in the audience for the person who is the most turned on. And I play to that person, hoping to bring others up to the level of energy of that person. So, but it's the person who is most enthusiastic who gives me the energy that I need on stage. Well, guess who was giving that energy to Elton John all through that performance? Guess who helped make that performance what it was? It was my artist standing there whooping, hollering, whistling, and going crazy. The odd thing is how long it took me to realize that.
Right.
So at any rate, so basically I edited Circus, and I gave 6 months notice, and I was put together with Seymour Stein, and Seymour's record label, Sire, was one of 14 record labels distributed by a company called Gulf and Western. And Gulf and Western was the era of conglomerates, companies that swallowed other companies whole. And Gulf and Western was known as Engulf and Devour because it was the biggest of the conglomerates. So they gave me an office with 3 windows overlooking Central Park from the 23rd floor at Columbus Circle. That building is now owned by Donald Trump. Back then it was the Gulf and Western building.
Wow.
And I founded a public and artist relations department from scratch. And little things like this happened. Our president, Tony Martell, had been involved with Jesus Christ Superstar. And that's why he was hired by Gulf and Western. He'd been at CBS when they'd had this huge smash with Jesus Christ Superstar. But before I ever arrived at the company, Tony had been told that his son had leukemia, his 16-year-old son. And in those days, leukemia was a death sentence.
Yeah.
So Tony came in every morning at 9 o'clock. Record company presidents do not do that. They come in at 10 or 11 because they have to be out of clubs checking out bands the previous night.
Right.
Tony came in at 9. He had these huge wooden doors in a corner office. He locked those doors. We never saw him. Now, for me, that was terrific. It meant I could do anything I wanted. And what I did was quickly determine that 12 of our 14 record companies were not really record companies. There was no there. But 2 were amazements. And one of them was Sire Records. The other one was in Nashville. It was called Dot Records. It was number 3 on the country and western charts, and it wanted to be number 1. And it had the smarts and the dedication to become number 1. So that's where I put all my time. But one day, the A&R guy, A&R means artist and repertoire, and it means the talent scout. So the talent scout for Paramount Records, which was one of our absolutely nothing record companies, walked into my office. And this was a guy who was wildly enthusiastic when he discovered a new talent. And just seeing his enthusiasm was a sheer pleasure. And so he started talking about this girl he'd found in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. She was 13 years old, and she was going to be a gorilla, and she was going to be a smash, and yada, 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 yada was one of his phrases. He went on for 15 minutes, and it was amazing that he didn't have to be unglued from the ceiling. He had such high energy. But I knew that anybody signed by that record label didn't have a chance in hell. Not a prayer. But then he caught me unawares. He said, but I have her doing a showcase tomorrow at the Plaza Hotel. Well, the Plaza Hotel is just a 5-minute walk through Central Park from Columbus Circle. And I'm head of artist relations, the public and artist relations. Artist relations means I have to be there whenever an artist shows up in town to show that the company is doing something for them. And if we're not doing anything for them, I told them so. But one way or the other, I have to be there. So I showed up at the Plaza Hotel the next day. And it's an amphitheater type thing, tiers of tables, and they're circular tiers, and they're all focused on the center of the stage. And all of a sudden, this squash-looking little African-American 13-year-old, about 4'8", takes to the stage. And the minute she gets to center stage, it's as if she has grabbed you by the esophagus. She has put her nose up to your nose, and she tells you, sit, stand, shake hands, obey. And she holds on to you at the core for 45 frigging minutes. It is astonishing. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it in my life before. Well, meantime, because our president wasn't running the company, we had this other company. Gulf of Western had this other company called Paramount Pictures. And Paramount Pictures was wildly successful with smash after smash after smash after smash. And the guy who made it successful, the president of Paramount, was a legend. It was said that he was a combination of Napoleon and Attila the Hun. So the next morning, there was this room. It was always dark, and our secretaries always went there to get extra Xerox paper when the Xerox machines ran out. So I thought it was a storage room. Well, I walked in one morning, and the room was brightly lit. And it turned out that the boxes of Xerox papers had been standing on something. And that something was a conference table. And the conference table had yellow pads at every seat and sharpened pencils at every seat and an 8.5 by 11 sheet of God knows what, a list of something, Lord knows what. I had never known it was a conference room before. And we were summoned to our first staff meeting. The first staff meeting we were ever going to have in my time in this company. And I've been there for, I don't know, 6 or 7 months or something like that. So we all filed into the conference room. We all took our seats. Tony Martell, our president, took his place at the head of the table and started talking about how we were not making money, so we were going to have to save money on things like yellow pads and sharpened pencils, exactly what was right in front of us. And as he was talking about that, we felt a presence behind us. It was as if a storm cloud had rolled in. 12 lightning bolts had just gone off. The clouds were thundering. It was as if there were people on trumpets with 10,000 laser beams coming in behind us. And this 5-foot, 5-inch man started walking down the length of the table. And as he walked that length, Tony Martell began to shrink in his seat. Let me see if I can show you. He went like this and this and this. He was slumping in his seat. And he was 6'2". And by the time this little tiny man who had just come into the room, okay, there, computer was doing something. So at any rate, the further this little tiny man got toward the head of the table, the shorter Tony Martell became. And finally, Tony Martell slid off of his seat like a jellyfish and slid onto the seat next to it. And this little tiny man took over at the head of the table. And he looked at this 8.5 by 11 sheet with a list on it. And it was a list of records. But it was a list of records none of us had ever heard of before. It was apparently records we were allegedly going to release. And so Tony Martell looked at the first department head on his left and said, "You, what are you doing about this record?" Pointing to the number 1 record on the list. Now, I had heard about bullshitting in oral exams, but I had never seen it. It was just a rumor. All of a sudden, I saw it. And this department had made up such a convincing, vivid, detailed story that it was astonishing. But frankly, I doubt that he had ever heard of that record until that moment. Then Martell got to number 2 and asked the same question. Another brilliant example of extemporaneous storytelling with no relationship to reality. And finally, he got to me. And I stood up and said, "Mr. Martell, I am not doing anything about this record. In fact, I am not doing anything about any of the records on this list. They come from phantom record companies. We don't even have the names of or the phone numbers of the presidents of these companies. But yesterday I saw, and I told him the story of Stephanie Mills, the girl I had seen on stage. And when I finished, Tony Martell got up, didn't say a word, and walked out of the room. So you never notice it, but when there are a whole bunch of you in a room and you're all getting out at once, there's a scrum at the door. You're all squished together trying to get through the door frame. And as I was being squished through that door frame, the vice president over my head grabbed my arm so hard I had the marks of his fingers on my arm for the rest of the week. And he said, "You fucking nun. If you ever do that again, you're fired. And when I got to my office, my secretary was standing 12 feet beyond the door waiting for me. And she said, you had a call from Mr. Yablon's office. Frank Yablon was the president of Paramount Pictures. He's gathering all of his department heads tomorrow at noon. He wants to see you, and he wants to see Stephanie Mills. And from that point on, I became a staff member at Paramount Pictures. Whenever they were launching a blockbuster, they would call me in for the meeting. And apparently Martel just told them, look, let him do anything he wants to do, and he will deliver results. And I did. And then we got to the point where Frank's brother, his little brother, Irwin, who had never made a movie before, made something that was unheard of in those days, a documentary feature about a black activist in Harlem named Sonny Carson, who happened, among other things, to be virulently anti-Semitic and virulently anti-Korean. He was a racist. But Irwin made this film. Well, because Frank was such a tyrant, a tyrannical figure, nobody wanted to work on his little brother's film. So I did that film's publicity all by myself. And Irwin, I mean, everybody at Paramount took it for granted that Irwin was talentless and Frank had just thrown him this money to keep him busy and out of trouble. No, Irwin went on to make the Halloween movies.
Wow.
And a bunch of other classic horror films that grossed a lot. So apparently Irwin had talent too. And Stephanie Mills got a part. There was the very first black-produced, black-written, black-directed Broadway musical ever. And it was based on The Wizard of Oz. And it was called The Wiz. And Stephanie Mills got the part of Dorothy. And I basically built the groundwork for her career. And also did most of the publicity for The Wiz, which was a great deal of fun.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So then Gulf and Western, it was losing money consistently on its record division, its music division. So it decided to sell its music division to ABC Records. And first of all, okay, which part of the story to tell you first? I got a call months and months later from the lawyer who had negotiated the deal on behalf of Gulf and Western. And he said, you know why we were able to sell that little pissant record company for so much money, don't you? And I said, no, I mean, business is not my business. I'm in the business of building careers and building artists and much more, which I'll tell you about later. But money is not my concern. It's not my area of expertise. So I said, no, I have no idea. And he said, it's because of you. And I didn't believe him. And then he explained, when Gulf and Western sold its entire music operation to ABC Records, the two prizes in the batch were Sire Records and Dot Records. The president of Sire Records flew out to California and said, if they get rid of you, he will walk. And the president of Dot Records went out and said exactly the same thing. You doubled the value of that record company in the year that you were there, which is amazing. I didn't believe him. It took me years to absorb the message and come to believe him. So at any rate, a vice president from ABC Records flew into New York City, gathered all of the staff together in one room. This is the first time all 57 of us have been gathered together in one room, ever, and made a speech. And he said, go on about your business as usual. There will be no blood flowing in the corridors of this company, which to me meant we are in severe trouble. The guillotine is being sharpened at this very moment. So I put my staff to work figuring out how many inches of space, how many minutes of time on the radio or on television we had gotten, and using standard rate and data service to figure out what that time and those inches would have cost in advertising dollars if they'd been purchased. And it turned out that for every dollar that Gulf and Western was spending on my department, we brought in $11 worth of exposure. And then one day, it was one of those snowy days in New York when there's a blizzard and you catch a cab. The cab driver will often ask if he can pick up another passenger. This is in the days before Uber and Lyft.
Right.
So we picked up another passenger at Young and Rubicam, one of the biggest ad agencies out there. And I explained to him what we had just discovered. That for every dollar that Gulf and Western had spent, they'd gotten $11 worth of exposure. He said, no, your arithmetic is all wrong. And I thought, I knew it. It was too good to be true. But maybe they're getting $2 for every dollar they're spending. I must have overstated this. No, he said, you've understated this. In advertising, we take it for granted that every inch of editorial space is worth 5 inches of ad space, because the editorial space has credibility and the ad space does not. So for every dollar they spent on your department, you brought in $55 worth of exposure. So 2 weeks after the Blood in the Corridor speech, everybody in the company got pink slips. 56 out of 57 people got pink slips.
Holy shit.
And the only person who didn't get a pink slip was me. And I resigned. And I resigned because they had just fired my staff. Now, everything was shrinking at Gulf and Western around me. But they kept funneling me money to hire more staff. It was astonishing. I couldn't figure out why. At any rate, but I couldn't operate without a staff. I had done what 5 people were hired later on to do at Circus Magazine. And I never wanted to have to do that again. I wanted an organization, and that's what I had built. So I resigned. And it seemed like 2 hours later, but it must have been the next day, the same vice president who had made the Blood in the Corridor speech had flown in from California again. And he said, get out a blank piece of paper. So I got out a blank piece of paper. In those days, we used paper. I don't use paper anymore. And he said, now write down your name, write down the names of all of the staff people you want to keep, then write down the salaries you want for each of us, for each of you. So I wrote down the names of all my staff members. I gave everybody, including myself, a 20% raise. And that was it. Now I was the East Coast Public and Artist Relations Department for ABC Records. And here I was at ABC, and we never had any music on the charts. We never had a song anywhere near the charts, unless you count the country and Western charts with Dot Records down in Nashville. And all of a sudden, I'm in this new company, and they have a record at number 3 on the pop charts. I was astonished. And then I discovered that nobody in the West Coast PR department would work with this act that was number 3 on the charts. I was stunned. I mean, to me, having a record on the charts was a whole new phenomenon. And why? Why wouldn't they work on this? Because it was a mixed band. It was black and white musicians and a black lead singer. So I decided the manager of this band is flying in from California to New York. He lives in New York. He's married to Diana Ross. Tracy Ross Ellis, or whatever her name is, the comedian, is his daughter.
Really?
And if I go out and pick him up in a limousine, and I have an unlimited budget to do nice things for people in New York, because I'm head of artist relations in addition to public relations. So if I go out to the airport and pick him up in a limousine, we will be baked in rush hour traffic at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And I will have him as an absolute prisoner. So while I had him a prisoner in that limousine, I said, look, I know your brand prides itself on its democracy. I know that it prides itself on the fact that every member is equal to every other member. But if you let me put all the attention on the lead singer and you cover my ass with the band, I guarantee you I will give you a star. Well, I had never said that before in my life. But it's one of those things, again, you know, but you don't know how you know it. But you know it with absolute certainty. And so I put all of the focus on the lead singer, and see if you've heard of her. Her name is Chaka Khan.
Absolutely.
Yes, so that's how Chaka began her career.
Wow.
Yeah. And Chaka Khan's story was amazing, and there was no way I could tell it. Because what Chaka did, well, first, when she was in high school, they used to have student demonstrations all the time. They particularly were upset about the food in the cafeteria. They didn't like it. But it was a black school. Now, if it had been a white school, the police would have regarded it as a protest.
Right.
But in a black school, they regarded it as a riot. So the police came in and started clubbing people.
Jeez.
And her best friend was on the ground, and the police were not treating her nicely. And so Shaka took her book bag and hit the policeman over the head with it, knocked him out, and got her friend away. Later, when she graduated from high school, she was with a little group of people her age, guys and women. And what they would do is they would send Shaka to an upscale bar. And Shaka would make friends with a woman who was wearing fabulous jewelry at the bar. And Shaka would dope the woman's drink with LSD. And then Shaka would take her to meet her friends. And her friends, while she was totally stoned out of her mind, would take all of her jewelry. And then they would put her on a bus. They put her on a bus. So she'd go to the end of the line, still so stoned she had no idea where she was or what had just happened to her, until finally she regained enough of her senses to be able to go back to her own apartment. So this was how Shaka made a living for a while. It wasn't the nicest story in the world, and I had to bury it, unfortunately. So then there was another story. We had this artist named Joe Walsh. And Joe Walsh's music is just terrific, and his lyrics are terrific. And he was a member of the Eagles, and he wrote, I believe, Hotel California and Life in the Fast Lane, or something like that. He was wonderful. So I got a call from the president of the company saying, Joe Walsh is coming into town. He's being handled by an outside PR firm, so you don't really have to worry about it. But just go over and say hello and show that the company cares. The hotel where Joe Walsh was staying was the hotel where the Beatles had stayed when they first arrived in America, and it happened to be my father's favorite hotel as well. And it was across the street from ABC. So I went across the street. I went up to the fourth floor. I went down to the final room at the very end where Joe Walsh was staying. And I knocked on the door, and the door opened this far. And I could see behind it a tiny little man. Now, look, I'm tiny. I'm 5'5". But the guy behind the door was 4 inches shorter than I am. And beyond him was Joe Walsh on his hands and knees on the floor, utterly incapable of speaking a word of English. Trying, it was babbling coming out of his mouth, but that's all he could do with maximum effort. That's all he could do. And so thus I was introduced to my two of my enemies in the music industry. One is the manager for Joe Walsh, whose name is Irving Azoff, who was the smartest, most powerful man in the industry and had a particular talent, keeping himself invisible, and cocaine. Those would be my two biggest enemies in the music industry for the next batch of years. And then I went out to see B.B. King, just to show that we cared. And B.B. had a manager named Sid Sheinberg, and I had spent time going up to Sid Sheinberg's office at various times. And Sid Sheinberg, well, B.B. told me a story. He said, when you have a new baby, never neglect your first child. And what he meant was Sid Sheinberg had Gladys Knight and the Pips, and they were doing amazing things on the charts. And B.B. did not want to be lost in the shadow behind Gladys Knight and the Pips. But Sid Sheinberg did astonishing things, like getting B.B. King on a Rolling Stones tour and a U2 tour. And these things positioned B.B. as what he is today, the king of the blues, with a total crossover audience. So those are my adventures at ABC. And one day I was sitting in my cubicle at ABC Records, and Seymour Stein came by, and he poked his head on my office. He was on his way to a meeting, and he said, "Schmuck, if you're so smart, why don't you have your own company?" Now, look, I cannot throw a baseball. I cannot catch a baseball. I cannot do any of the things normal humans can do. The only thing I have is my brain. So challenge me on smarts. It's like that girl when I was in 8th grade with the theory of relativity. Challenge me on my smarts, and it stings. It hurts. So eventually, I started my own company. And I started my company with the Climax Blues Band and Renaissance, Seymour's two artists, and managed by a guy named Miles Copeland. And I have to tell you the Copeland story because it's fascinating. With Stephanie Mills, and with another band that two friends had brought me called ZZ Top.
Wow.
And yeah, and that's how I got started. I got started on half of a coffee table in the living room of a guy named Danny Goldberg, who would later become the president of Atlantic Records and the president of Polydor Records, and would manage Nirvana.
Wow.
And yeah, and he said, look, why don't you work out of my living room? I'll give you half of my coffee table, and I have an assistant. You can pay half her salary, and you can have half of her time. And so that's basically how I got started. And then it's a long story from there to Michael Jackson, Prince, Bob Marley, Bette Midler, AC/DC, Aerosmith, Kiss, Queen, Run DMC, Billy Joel, Billy Idol, Paul Simon, Peter Gabriel, David Byrne, people like that. And the story is in Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me. Wait, I've got a copy of it here. There it is, Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, A Search for Soul in the Power Pits of Rock and Roll. But it's a story of trying to find the gods inside, of trying to find human soul. Because what I would develop over time was a process that I called secular shamanism. And here's how secular shamanism works. Imagine you've got a band and you come into my office to see if I'll work with you. And so I tell you, I may give you a little simple speech. And the simple speech goes like this. If you expect me to manufacture an artificial mask for you, an image, and tell you, like a guy sitting here in a plaid checked suit, flicking a cigar in his hands, and with that image, I'm going to make you a star, then I'm going to send you to my best competitor immediately. I'll have you in their office in 2 hours or less. If you're going to work with me, you have to understand. Music is not about an exchange of pieces of plastic. Music is not about an exchange of downloads. Music is not about an exchange of money. Music is about an exchange of human soul. So if you're going to work with me, my job is to find your soul. My job is to find the gods inside of you. And what do I mean by that? You're on deadline to finish an album. You sit down at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in front of a blank computer screen or a blank piece of paper, and you have paper shock. You know you cannot write a lyric. You wonder how you've ever written a lyric in your life. And by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on a reasonably good day, there's a lyric in front of you. And once or twice in your life, that lyric is so perfect that it feels like it wrote itself through you. You had nothing to do with it. You were merely the pipe, the conduit. My job is to find the gods inside you that wrote those lyrics. When you go on stage on a really good night and you see the eyes of the audience grow wide and you see the pupils dilating and you see their faces melting and you see them melting into one giant amoebic blob of energy, and that amoebic blob sends a pseudopod out to you and sends its energy through you as if you were an empty pipe, and that energy goes to someplace around your head, and it's utterly transmogrified and channeled back to the audience again. And once again, you see their eyes widening even further, and the energy comes back to you again, and you have an out-of-body experience. You feel that you're on the ceiling watching all of this take place, and you watch yourself be danced like a puppet, like a marionette on stage for 70 minutes, charged by that flow, that reciprocal flow with the audience. I'm going to find the gods inside of you that danced you on stage. And to do it, I'm going to take 6 weeks to research you. You won't see any results out of my office for 6 weeks. And when I finish researching you, I will come out to see you in whatever environment reflects who you are the best, with no wives, no managers, no assistants, no intercessors of any kind. It's just you and me. And my job is to find the gods inside of you and then to introduce the hello, how are you, fine, thank you very much, self of everyday life to the gods inside of you. And then I will come back every year, because every year as you change, those gods will change. They will mature and grow. And I will come back every year to find those gods and how they have changed and introduce you to them. Now, what was I talking about? John Mellencamp is one of the most extraordinary performers you will ever see in your life. And when John comes off stage, he looks like a scarecrow. He looks like he only has pits where his eyes used to be. And he is guided off stage to a little tiny room where he can lock himself in with just his wife or just me, just one other person. Why? Because it takes an hour for his normal everyday self to return after that experience. I mean, to describe that experience, Eric Clapton was on heroin. George Harrison and Peter Townsend, the founder of the band The Who, were trying to get Eric off of heroin. George tried and he failed, but he wrote a song about it, Tangerine Dream or something like that. Peter Townsend went in and said, look, I understand why you do heroin. You go on stage, you become an empty pipe, you are filled with the souls of anywhere from 700 to 70,000 people. All those souls are flowing through you. They are flowing through you to the Godhead. At that time, Peter Townsend was into Mayor Baba and had his own concept of the Godhead. And then all of that energy flows back through you again. Then suddenly you come off stage. In fact, it happens the instant you step behind the curtain into the darkness. And suddenly you who held 70,000 people, 70,000 souls, and the Godhead are an empty pipe. And it hurts. And you try to fill that pipe with heroin. So that is the performance experience. That's the experience of the gods inside that I had been hunting ever since I was 12 years old, for God's sakes. So I ended up in rock and roll totally by accident. The magazine I was hired to edit it could have been about anything.
Right.
It could have been about cooking, botany, wine. It could have been about anything. I just lucked in to rock and roll, and rock and roll just happened to be where the gods are.
Right. You look at any big name, chances are they've struggled with just that.
Oh, yes. And so one day, to show you what the impact was of this kind of thing, one day John Mellencamp called me. He didn't call very often at all. And he said, look, I've just been offered $1.25 million by Heinz Ketchup for my song Hurt So Good. Heinz Ketchup, in those days, the plastic squeeze bottle had not become universal. And Heinz Ketchup was in glass bottles.
Which is
and it took you 20 minutes to get that damn ketchup out of the bottle. You shook it, you banged on it, you did everything you could think of, and the ketchup still wouldn't come out of the bottle. And Heinz decided to make a virtue out of that flaw.
Yeah.
So it had taken a song by Carly Simon, Anticipation,
I remember
and
that.
used it. And now it wanted to use Hurt So Good. So John said, should I take the offer? And I said, John, what do you want to be in 15 years? Do you want to be living off of the interest on your investments? Or do you want to be doing your music in front of audiences? And John said, I want to be doing music in front of my audiences. And I said, then you have to turn down the money. And here's why. When we become 12 years old or so and our hormones start flowing and we go from being children into young adults, it is a really wrenching transition. And we are pre-programmed by our biology to throw ourselves out of the comfort of our parents' home and to instead join groups of peers. But we are lonely as hell, and we don't feel that anybody understands us. Well, you represent those kids. Now imagine yourself back in the days of Isaiah, Jerusalem with its high, high walls, and you are locked out. And you stand out there outside the walls of that walled city, John, and you raise your fist. And in raising your fist, you say, I have a right to exist. I am important. I have an identity. And you say that on behalf of all those lost kids who've been thrown out of the city and tossed into the desert by becoming adolescents. And if you take that ketchup commercial, You enter the gates of that city and you become one of the people within it. And you lose your ability to make that statement on behalf of your audience. So John turned down the ketchup commercial. And it wasn't until about 2 or 3 years ago that I discovered that that's why John lost his manager. He was managed by Billy Gaff, who managed Rod Stewart. And Billy Gaff could not take that, turning down $1.25 million. And John called and said, what manager should I go with? Who would you recommend? And I recommended Tommy Mottola, who at that point was one of the two most powerful men in the record industry, because I enjoyed working with Tommy, because if you had an idea and Tommy saw it as a good one, he would let you run with it. I mean, with Tommy, I'd worked with Hall & Oates, and I had looked, what did I look for in looking for the gods inside of you? I looked for passion points. I looked for imprinting points. I looked for key moments in your life that made you who you are. And in the case of Daryl Hall and John Oates, they had imprinted on the Temptations. They wanted to be the Temptations. They had hung out backstage or outside the stage door every time the Temptations played Philadelphia, waiting for the Temptations to come out so that they might get an autograph or meet them for just a second. So I said to Tommy, look, the Apollo Theater, I reopened the Apollo Theater 3 years ago. And I had reopened it when I didn't know who was bankrolling the reopening of the Apollo Theater. It had been closed for a couple of years. And, you know, it's a cultural mecca. It's a cultural landmark. It is the voice of Harlem. It wasn't until the opening night when we had a grand party that went all the way up and down 125th Street for a block that I was introduced to the guy who was paying my bills. He was a tall, elegant guy in a tuxedo who had the most charming smile you've ever seen in your life, and he was really happy to see me, and his name was Nicky Barnes. You know who Nicky Barnes was? Yeah. Okay, so he was, the drug business in Harlem was owned by the Italian mob.
Yeah.
Nicky Barnes ran a group, a black gang that shoved the mafia out of Harlem and took over the drug business. So here he was, one of the sweetest looking men in the world, and you can imagine how many deaths he had caused, how many people he had murdered. Well, the Apollo Theater was about to reopen for the second time. The Nicky Barnes reopening didn't last all that long. And this time it was being reopened by a guy named Percy Sutton, who had been the borough chief, Manhattan borough chief, and who had been a key guy in the Dinkins administration, and who owned the biggest black radio stations in North America. And I had been introduced to him through a Bob Marley story, which I'll have to tell you. So, and he was famous, Percy Sutton was famous for not taking calls from white people. So I told Tommy, the Apollo Theater is reopening. Let's get Hall & Oates in as the opening act along with the Temptations, which is a dream come true for Daryl and John. And if you get the Temptations, I will get the Apollo Theater. I will get Percy Sutton. So Tommy went out and got the Temptations, and I called Percy Sutton, and indeed he took my call, and he said, well, I've got the opening night booked, but the second night I haven't got booked. So we ended up being the second night at the Apollo Theater. And I told Tommy, there's this new thing, and it's selling like crazy. It's a VHS tape of concerts. So make a VHS tape of this. And Tommy did, and it sold like crazy. So I knew that Tommy, if he had a person with strong ideas, can help implement those ideas. That's what he did for me, and I figured he would do it for John. I was wrong. Tommy Mottola would later call his experience with John Mellencamp the worst hell he'd ever been through in his life.
Wow.
Because John can be very difficult, but he wasn't, for the most part, difficult with me. The one thing that he did that I found problematic was one day I did the figures and realized that we had the biggest selling album of 1983. John Mellencamp who the press had loathed before I started working with him. And my job was to establish his legitimacy by showing who he really was and what his roots really were. And he had one of the most amazing, authentic stories you've ever seen of growing up in Indiana, starting fights in bars and strange things like that. So we turned the press around totally on John. And now we have the biggest selling album of the year. So I put out a press release saying that we had the biggest selling album of the year. And then I got a call from Bob Merlis, who was the vice president of public relations for Warner Brothers Records. Now, in those days, Warner Brothers Records had 1/3 of the music industry. 1/3, that's a giant section. And its competitor, CBS Records, had the other third of the music industry. And the other remaining companies in the record industry had to split a third between them. These were monster, huge companies, brilliantly run. And Bob said, you just put out a press release saying John Mellencamp is the biggest selling album of 1983. And I said, yes, I did. And he said, no, John Mellencamp doesn't have the biggest selling album of 1983. Europa has the biggest selling album of 1983. Well, Europa was an artificial band put together by some clever talent scout. It wasn't real. So I said to Merlis, look, you show me the figures demonstrating that Europa has the biggest selling album of 1983, bigger than John Mellencamp. I personally will put out a press release saying that Europa has the biggest selling album of the year. But until you show me those figures, no, wait, I'm going to have myself the story. What Bob said was, after he said that Europa has the biggest selling album of the year, and I said, no, they don't, I've done the figures. He said, you don't understand me. We have 1/3 of the record industry. And you know I have really good friends at CBS, and they have another 1/3 of the record industry. If John Mellencamp has the biggest selling album of the year, you will never get another client from Warner Brothers in your life, and you will never get another client from CBS. And that's when I said, Bob, you show me the figures proving that Europa has the biggest selling album of the year. And if those figures turn out to be accurate, I will put out a press release saying Europa has the biggest selling album of the year. But until you produce those figures, John Mellencamp has the biggest selling album of the year. And then we hung up. 2 minutes later, I got a call from John Mellencamp. Remember, I very seldom got calls from John Mellencamp. His timing was perfect. Now, John bills himself as the little bastard. He bills himself as a tough guy. So I thought he would approve of what I had just done. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience. This is the only time in my life I've ever had this experience. As I was telling John the story, I could hear John filling up with yellow like a piss cup at a doctor's office. And when I was finished, John said, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have done that. I was stunned. I was astonished. That was not the John Mellencamp that I knew and actually that I loved. And 10 years later, when I was sick in a bed, because I was sick in a bed for 15 years, John called and I said, do you remember this story? And he didn't. And I told him the story again. And he said, thank God you did that. You were responsible for tens of millions of dollars in my career. What he really meant was you were responsible for my career because it isn't primarily the money for which John is danced by the gods inside of him for 70 minutes on stage. That is not about money. That is about a sheer act of soul. So at any rate, so that's the value of having somebody who will come in and do secular shamanism, who will look for the gods inside of you, who will introduce you to the gods inside of you, and who will keep you in touch with the gods inside of you. And the Bob Marley story that led to my relationship with Percy Sutton being strong enough that he would take my call when he didn't. I'm white. You notice that on the video? I worked with, I got a call one day from the president of Island Records. Island Records was established by Chris Blackwell. And the president of Island Records said, you've done this amazing campaign for, there was a new record company that was being founded by Universal, and I'd gotten them into just about everything you could imagine. And I'd gotten three feature stories on them at New York Magazine. You know, one day I gave this story angle to the account executive I had on the case, who was a young, very intelligent, very articulate guy. And he came back to me and he stood at my desk and he said, "This angle is not worth anything. You're not going to be able to sell it to anybody. I can't sell it to anybody." So just to show him, you know, just out of sheer piqued pride, I called New York Magazine's financial person and I scheduled lunch for the next day at the Oyster Bar at 42nd Street in Manhattan. And I pitched him on the angle that my account executive had said was unpitchable. And we got 3 feature stories in one issue of New York Magazine. 3. So much for the angle that was unpitchable. So at any rate, so one of the campaigns that I had done, it caught the eye of Chris Blackwell. So the president of Chris's record company wanted to have a meeting. Then another campaign caught Chris Blackwell's eye, and he decided, oh, forget about the guy who did campaign number 1. I want the guy who did campaign number 2. So his record company president did some research to find who did campaign number 2. Guess who campaign number 2 was done by? Yeah, me. So they basically, Chris Blackwell kept me in his brain trust for the next 10 years. You have to understand, Chris Blackwell would hire somebody, he'd be curious about somebody, and then he'd fire them within 18 months. He never kept anybody longer than 18 months. He kept me for 10 years.
Wow.
So one day I got a call from Chris Blackwell saying, we got a problem. Bob Marley can sell out soccer stadiums with 120,000 people anywhere in the world he wants, with the exception of North America. And here in North America, the most he can sell is 30,000 tickets in New York City. 30,000 tickets. Do you have any idea what we should do to expand his base? And I said, yes, I've got an idea. The idea is this. Your publicists did a brilliant job of establishing Bob with white college audiences. A terrific job. But Bob is black. And Bob's natural base is the black community. Now, there's a problem. Bob is from the islands. And there's a real rift in the black community between island blacks and African Americans, North American blacks. It's huge. But I had become, by that point, the best black publicist in the music industry, despite not being black. And so I explained that we would establish a black base for Bob. And it made sense to him, so he asked me to come to a meeting. The meeting was about 5 blocks north of Times Square someplace. And Percy Sutton was sitting at the head of the table. Bob Marley and Chris Blackwell were sitting down the length of the table to your left. And I was seated down the length of the table to your right. And Percy Sutton made a speech in which he made it clear that he regarded Bob Marley as close to Jesus Christ on earth. And in fact, Bob was regarded as having a prophetic stature. And Bob is sitting there absorbing all of this. And then they explained the problem. We can sell 30,000 tickets in New York City. That means we can sell out 1.5 nights at Madison Square Garden. And the first night will look good, and the second night will look pathetic, because there will be so many empty seats. And I said, okay, here's the answer. There's a theater at 74th Street called the Beacon Theater. It seats 3,000. If we book the Beacon Theater instead of booking Madison Square Garden, Bob can sell out 10 nights and still have people who weren't able to get tickets. And having people who weren't able to get tickets is vitally important, because people spread word of mouth that they couldn't get a Marley ticket. And the next time you come into town, people will be even hungrier for Bob Marley. You have to keep your audience hungry. So they all thought it was a brilliant idea, and that's the plan we went with. That's how I came to know Percy Sutton, because Percy let me have my way in that meeting, if that's what you want to call it. He let me make the decisive proposal at the meeting. So, but then we had a problem with Bob. 6 months into the campaign, we were getting Bob. There are black weekly newspapers all over North America, and those reach the black community, but most publicists either don't know they exist, or if they do know they exist, don't pay any attention to them. And we were getting them Bob Marley stories every single week. new ones every single week, and with pictures. And that's what they appreciate. They love having pictures to fill their pages with nice, meaty captions. So we were feeding those on a regular basis to the black press, and I got a phone call. And the phone call, the caller said, Bob Marley has terminal cancer. And the caller explained something. She said, look, every morning Bob gets up. He's at a chalet in Switzerland so that he can be near an alternative doctor. You are not allowed to tell the press where he is. Bob wants you to say that he's in Ethiopia. Because remember, Bob was a Rastafarian. And when I first met Bob, I insisted on meeting people in the place that reflected them most. But Bob didn't happen to be in Jamaica. He happened to be at his home in Florida, in Miami. So I went to visit Bob at his home in Miami. I studied Bob like crazy. And I spent 4 hours with Bob. And in that 4 hours, I didn't understand a word Bob said. He was speaking a patois so thick that I just couldn't understand it. But I understood a couple of things. There are gang wars in Jamaica. Being black in Jamaica is very dangerous. And Bob explained, the one story I did understand was Bob saying he was in a club. Now, people were killed in these clubs all the time. And he felt a tap on his shoulder. And he heard a voice. And it told him to leave immediately. And he left. And a few minutes later, the police broke in. And the police in Jamaica are just another armed gang.
Yeah.
So it's one armed gang against another. And there's a lot of shooting.
Very correct.
And yeah, Bob felt that God had tapped him on the shoulder, that he had a personal relationship with God. And as I was leaving, I said, if you ever need anything in New York, let me know. And Bob said, yes, there is something I need. It's a story from 1938 about Haile Selassie giving a speech at the United Nations. I need a copy of that story. Well, we didn't have Google in those days.
Right.
So finding a story like that was going to be very difficult. But I committed to doing it, and I did. I got him that story. More important, I suddenly realized he's a Rastafarian. Who is Rastafari? Rastafari is God, but Rastafari is also Haile Selassie. In other words, Haile Selassie is God. So when I was told to tell people that Bob was in Ethiopia, Ethiopia is heaven in Rastafarian terms. So, but I was also told, look, Bob gets up every morning, goes down to breakfast. He has newspapers from all over the world laid out around his breakfast plate. If any one of those papers say Bob Marley is dying of cancer, Bob leaves the table without eating breakfast, goes back up to his bedroom, never turns the light on, sits there for the rest of the day in a state of depression. If he sees all of those papers in the morning and not a single one says that Bob Marley has cancer, he goes out on the lawn after he eats breakfast and plays soccer with his guys. Bob always had a tribe traveling with him, about 25 people traveling with him. He was the head of the tribe. So my job became to keep the fact that Bob had terminal cancer out of the headlines. So every week, I got every detail on what Bob had done that week. And when the press started calling, I came in early on Monday mornings because I had calls from Sweden and Switzerland and Italy and Holland. And I told the press what Bob had been doing in gorgeous detail. And I gave them so much information that the story of Bob having cancer or not having cancer never even came up. So I realized something. You and I have a terminal illness. It's called life.
Exactly.
Right, and it always ends in death. So how we live that life depends on how we perceive it. We have a choice. We can perceive each day as living, or we can perceive each day as dying. My job was to make sure that Bob perceived each day as living, and to make that period, to the best of my limited abilities, the richest period of time in Bob's life. And then 8 months later or something like that, I got a call. And the caller said, Bob doesn't need you anymore. And it almost put me in tears. Because I had been fighting for Bob's life this entire time. And you only get a call like that when Bob has given up, when Bob can't fight anymore. And 2 weeks later, he was dead. And it was, even though I never understood Bob Marley, except in these indirect ways, there was an emotional attachment there, unlike the attachment I've ever had with any other artist, even Michael Jackson, with whom I had a deep, deep, deep attachment. And so whenever I have to tell this story or write about it, it's one of the most difficult things around because it always puts me on the brink of tears.
It's such a huge loss, you know, I think to everybody, honestly.
Yeah. So, and Bob, you know, one of the things that I sensed when I started the art studio was I now had a periscope position from which to find my way into the dark underbelly where new myths and movements were made. Bob Marley has achieved a mythic stature. He's become a symbol of certain basic things in the human experience, freedom above all.
Right.
So that was working with Bob, which was not a normal experience.
No doubt.
And working with John Mellencamp and finding out who he was. I mean, when I went out to Indiana and I had studied all of his lyrics, and we sat down in an empty living room, and I tried to find out his passion points, his imprinting moments, the moments that made his passions, who he was, the gods inside of him, and discovered what it was like growing up as a teenager in Indiana. Basically, the major part of the story was that Bob or John grew up watching Paul Newman movies, in particular HUD and Cool Hand Luke. And in his mind, John was Paul Newman at the center of the screen. And he was that way in high school. He was the leader of the gang that, as I said, would jump into cars and go to distant towns and go into bars and try to pick up girls and try to start fights. And to me, who grew up coming up with a new theory of the beginning, middle, and end of the universe at that age, this was a revelation. This was unlike anything I had ever heard before. But the real turning point came when when John graduated from high school, because up until that moment he had felt like he filled the center of the screen, like Paul Newman filling the center of a CinemaScope screen in your local theater. And all of a sudden, John felt that he had become a pixel in an almost infinite screen, that he had become invisible. And he was so demotivated, it was hard for him even to pick up his socks in the morning and put them on. And then music eventually helped save him from all of this. So that was, I mean, the Mellencamp story. When Danny Goldberg, remember Danny Goldberg, the guy who gave me half of his living room cafe table or coffee table and half of his assistant?
Right.
So when Danny Goldberg wrote a book called Stumbling into Genius, I'm in it. And he says that Howard Bloom treated John Mellencamp as if he were a religion. I believed in John passionately, all my heart. And I taught John how to deal with the press. Up until then, he had a terrible relationship with the press. He wanted to get into the business, the manager he wanted to manage him was Tony DeFries. Tony DeFries was the manager of David Bowie. Remember how David Bowie had been the B track for Circus Magazine?
Yep.
So every month I had a visit from a gorgeously made up, gorgeous young woman carrying a stack of slide sheets this thick with pictures of what David Bowie had been up to. And I was allowed to have exclusive use of any dozen of those photos that I wanted. That was my contact with Tony DeFries' office. Well, John had gotten into his car and come to New York and sat in Tony DeFries' waiting room for I don't know how many days. And Tony wouldn't see him. And finally, he had dropped off his tape with the receptionist. And the receptionist happened to be from Indiana. And John is from Indiana and has always been headquartered there. And she listened to the tape. And she was impressed. And Tony DeFries probably thought that John was a pretty face. I mean, God knows what Tony's sexual orientation was. But so Tony had figured that he had made David Bowie's career through one brilliant move. David Bowie's original name was David Jones. And Tony had changed it to David Bowie. So since that was his great stroke of brilliance, of genius, he changed John Mellencamp's name to Johnny Cougar.
Right.
And then he decided to put out a coffee table book, got together with a guy who was the head of a kind of underground trade magazine in the music industry, who helped pinpoint the most important people in the rock press. And he put together a coffee table book with a picture of each of the most important people in the rock press and a little mini bio of them. And he figured, okay, so I'm going to win them over to John Mellencamp, to John Cougar, that they're going to pay attention to Johnny Cougar. He didn't understand the mentality of the press. Press people feel that they are rigidly independent, that they make up their own minds by themselves, that they can't be bought. And putting a page in a coffee table book on each of them was like offering them $1,000 bill. It was an insult to their sense of integrity. So people like Ken Emerson, who was the head of the music critics for Rolling Stone, he assigned all of the music reviews from Rolling Stone, a very powerful position. He would get a John Mellencamp record, never take the shrink wrap off, write a review of the album without ever listening to it, and write two things: that John's music was shit and that John's personality was shit. That was it. And the rock crit elite, which is what the guy who named himself Pope of the rock critic elite called them, would get together for lunch. And if you liked the wrong people, you were despised. Right. You had a possibility of being thrown out of the group. You had to like the people the rest of the clique liked. And my whole job in life, one of my major jobs, aside from soul hunting, was to find a way to take that little group of sheep who followed the lead sheep and to turn them around by giving them such valid information with such deep validity that they couldn't deny it. So I tried selling John Mellencamp to the key members of the rock crit elite for 3 years. And for 3 years, they stopped treating him as if he were a miserable monster. And they stopped saying that his music was shit and that he was shit. But they weren't won over. And I had lunch after lunch after lunch telling John Mellencamp stories, the stories from his youth, and the stories from that lost period of his life that was so important, so crucial, when he became just a pixel on an infinite screen. And they listened, and they didn't care. And then John did a concert at Rockefeller Center. And John is amazing. He is amazing. And we did a little party at a room underneath the theater, a very plush room with velvet walls, red velvet walls. And each of the people I had taken to lunch came up to me, grabbed me by my biceps, and brought his face very close to mine and said, "You are right. You are right. You are right." And that's the moment that John Mellencamp went from being despised to being loved, to being adored, to being on the cover of Rolling Stone, to being on the cover of Spin, to being on the cover of just about everything else in sight.
That's amazing. I mean, people need an advocate sometimes to really kind of break that weird misconception, you know. And
they need an advocate because, remember, we are 5% rational verbal self, and we're 95% the selves below the floorboards of the self. Where are the gods inside? They're below the floorboards. And so we may learn to articulate those gods in our lyrics. We may learn to articulate them when we are danced like a marionette by them on stage, but we don't learn to articulate them to ourselves.
Right.
And it takes, the best mirror in which you can see yourself is the eyes of another person.
Exactly.
And it takes the eyes of another person to tell you who you are and what you are. And if you've got somebody who comes from a scientific background and has been a material mystic all of his life, who's been in search of the ultimate human experience, enlightenment, all of his life, the ecstatic experience all of his life, and yet has the scientific side, and yet has been told by Albert Einstein, you have to be not just any writer, but a great writer, you have an advocate who can express you to yourself. And that is of immense value. I mean, with Prince. So I have been following, I always followed the charts. Every Monday morning, there were 3 trade magazines. I sat down and read every single one of them from cover to cover by 11 o'clock in the morning. And I especially watched the charts. And something really weird was happening on the R&B charts. Now, look, nobody white at that point paid any attention to the R&B charts. That's a big mistake. That's a major source of our music.
Right.
And all of a sudden, this artist appeared that I had never heard of before. Not a word. And as I watched over the weeks, not only did his album rise on the charts, it went platinum. This just never happens. So I wondered who in the world this artist was and what strange magic he had. And then I got a call saying, we're working with Earth, Wind, and Fire. I was working with Earth, Wind, and Fire with a manager named Bob Cavallo. And I was told that Bob Cavallo has a new artist, and he would like us to work with him. And the new artist just happened to be that anonymous artist who had been going platinum without anybody noticing it in the press. His name was Prince. And so when I said yes to working with Prince, I got a call from Warner Brothers, from another PR person at Warner Brothers. Now, Warner Brothers and CBS, one of the reasons for their success was they hired Harvard-level people. They hired some of the most articulate, intelligent people in the business. So this articulate, intelligent publicist gets on the phone and says, you're not going to be able to work with Prince. Why? Because he can't do interviews. What do you mean? We put him into 2 interviews. He tried to strangle the first interviewer, and he wouldn't say a word to the second interviewer. He can't do interviews. So I made my demands, secular shamanism, that I get to spend 6 weeks studying him. And the lyrics, my God, the lyrics were astonishing. They were the most sexually explicit lyrics I had ever seen in my life. And then, when I demanded seeing Prince in his own environment, they flew me to, of all places, Buffalo, New York, my hometown, not his hometown, not Minneapolis, where he had grown up. And because Prince had taken over the Shea Theater, a theater where I'd gone to see a movie when I was 11 years old, and was rehearsing for his Dirty Minds tour. So I watched as Prince and the Revolution rehearsed on stage, and then Prince and I went backstage, and we found a room that we could lock, and we went in together, and we locked the door. We started at 2 o'clock in the morning. We finished at something like 7 or 8 in the morning, around dawn. And I got the story of Prince's passion points. First, what drew Prince to music? 5 years old is a vital time for passion points. There's almost always a passion point there for music in musicians. Well, Prince's dad was a jazz pianist, and his mom had taken him to see a rehearsal of his dad. So Prince walks into this theater with 500 seats, all pointed at the center point of the stage. And there's a light, and it's shining on the center point of the stage. And his father is in that light. And behind his father is, Prince says, 5 of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in my life. And that was it. That was Prince's passion point. Because imprinting points have to do with huge amounts of attention, coupled with sexuality. So, for example, Kevin Cronin from REO Speedwagon, his first passion point came when he was 5, and he saw Elvis Presley on the Ed Sullivan Show. And what did he see? A guy gyrating his hips,
right,
and girls screaming so loud you couldn't hear the music. Attention and sexuality, right? His second passion point came when he was 15, and he saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. And again, the girls were screaming so loud you couldn't hear the music. Attention and sexuality. Wham! 2 passion points for Kevin Cronin from REO Speedwagon, whose music is far more gut-grabbing than anybody has ever given it credit for, despite all of my work with that band. So how did I get into the story? Oh yes, passion points. So Prince's second passion point came when he was a teenager, and his friend Andre Simone's mother had a finished basement that nobody used. So Prince made a deal with Andre Simone's mother. He would be allowed to use that basement if he did his homework. And Prince established a society based on principles derived from a movement I had helped start in the 1960s and didn't tell you about. I had helped start something that got a name after I left it called the hippie movement. And there's a book, my book, How I Accidentally Started the 60s, is about that series of wild adventures that led to founding that movement. Well, Prince had taken one of our slogans, make love, not war, and turned it into a religion. And so in that basement, you were allowed to act out every sexual fantasy you had as long as there was mutual consent. And so Prince established a whole new society of his own. Now, look at Prince's dilemma. He was about 5'2". It took me 3 years to realize that fact. Because when I was in a room with Prince, Prince seemed much, much bigger than that. And so imagine being black in a mixed high school and 5'2". Your life is going to be made miserable. But so there's a standard society in that school. You know, the most popular kid gets to be president. The second most popular kid gets to be vice president. The most popular Jew gets to be treasurer. The most popular girl gets to be secretary, right? And you're not allowed into that because you're so small. So Prince set up an alternative society. And Prince has been setting up alternative societies, or had been. It's very hard for me to think of Prince in the past tense, or Michael in the past tense. But Prince has been setting up those alternative societies ever since. So it came down to a point where Prince, at the third year, the second year, he let me come out and interview him again. And then he had everybody he worked with go through what he considered to be the University of Bloom. He had me study them, interview them, give them a transcript of their interview oriented around the story, so it told a consecutive story, oriented around the passion points, but I never found passion points that meant anything with Vanity or with Morris Day of the time, or with Susie, whatever her name was. The ones I did find passion points with were Wendy and Lisa from the Revolution, who are still friends today. So Prince, I gave him a transcript of the story he had told me. And, you know, when you tell a story, you remember things from all different parts of the sequential order. And if somebody takes those stories and puts them on a timeline, all of a sudden they're a story. And told him, look, I'm going to set you up for 8 interviews a day, 3 days in New York, and 3 days in LA. And this is your story. This is the story your audience needs to hear from you. No matter what the interviewer asks you when he walks into the room, you have to direct him to this story. You have to start telling this story. And you can't say, as I just told the guy before you. No, you have to act as if you've never told the story to anyone before in your life. It's like when you go on stage. You don't excuse yourself to the audience for the fact that you're playing songs that you've been playing for the last year and you've played to 100 audiences so far. You do those songs as if you have never played them to anybody before in your life. Right. And that is your obligation in your interviews as well. And here's what's going to happen. The interviewer is going to walk in, and he, because they were all men in those days, he's going to ask you, how do you categorize your music? Which is one of the stupidest questions anybody has ever asked. And you will answer with your story. And he will go back home that night, and he will tell his wife, honey, I'm the greatest interviewer in the world. I asked this absolutely brilliant question. How do you categorize your music? And I got this great story out of Prince. So Prince felt that education was absolutely essential. Right. And in 1981, I came down with a severe back problem. And the back problem grew so bad that I couldn't go into my office anymore. I had to lay here naked under a sheet with a tray table, you know, one of those rolly things they use in hospitals over me. with 2 of my 7 Rolodexes and a phone, setting up arrangements between people in London and people in LA. And I got a call from Prince's management office. And a woman named, absolutely gorgeous, blonde woman named Jamie Shoup called and said, Prince has got a new act and you have to do your thing for him. And I said, but I can't, Jamie. I'm laying here in a bed naked under a sheet. And she said, it doesn't matter. Give me your address. We'll be there at 11:30 tomorrow morning. So at 11:30, my block was a slum in those days. These days, it's one of the most upscale blocks in North America. But it was a slum. And so you can imagine what the reaction of the neighbors was like when they saw this limousine, this stretch limousine coming around the corner and stopping at my building. And out of one side came a gorgeous California blonde. And out of the other side came a guy in a zoot suit who looked so sharply pressed. His creases were so sharply pressed that it looked as if he had a woman with an ironing board and an iron sitting next to him in the limousine the whole time. So he came up my 3 flights of stairs with dust balls the size of cats, and he entered the apartment. I mean, look, I kept this apartment top secret because I knew that the way I worked, which was 17-hour days, 7 days a week, and 8 years without any vacations, that my body would eventually burn out. I knew it would burn out sometime in my 40s, and I knew I was going to have to be able to find a way to make a living when I couldn't do anything anymore. And so my wife and I saved all of our money in order to buy a few buildings. And meanwhile, all of our furniture was stuff dragged in from off the street. So we would drag in these slightly damaged armchairs, big, comfy, stuffed armchairs. And my wife had an obsession with finding pregnant cats. And she would watch them with binoculars until all of a sudden they slimmed down, meaning they had dropped their litter. And then she would find the backyard where they had done it and scoop up the kittens and the mother if she could get her and have them spayed, and have my gorgeous blonde young stepdaughter went out on the street with kittens in her arms, giving the kittens away. So a total of 80 cats had made it through my apartment. And they had taken all the furniture. You know, they sharpened their claws on some furniture. So there was no stuffing left on the furniture. There was no fabric left on the furniture. There was just empty wood framework and springs. So my wife threw a sheet over one of these empty wood frameworks and springs, and Morris Day walked in the front door. He was goosed by one dog from the front, one dog from the rear, you know, the dog greeting, how do you smell at your particularly odoriferous orifices, and then was ushered into the bedroom where I'd at least put clothes on while I was laying there. And that's how we did our thing. And but the greatest privilege was when Prince spent a year. I mean, the stories with Prince. Okay, I have to tell you a John Mellencamp story. So the second year I went out to see Mellencamp finally showed me the Paul Newman movies that had meant so much to him.
Right.
He showed me HUD and he showed me Cool Hand Luke.
Before we continue, I got to take a pause for the cause here and put in an...
And I should probably go because I've got to go on 545 radio stations tonight.
Oh, Jesus.
It's Wednesday when I do Coast to Coast AM, and I haven't seen what my subject is for the week, and I haven't researched it yet. I got carried away. I didn't realize what time it was.
Oh, geez. It happens on this show all the time.
Well, good. I'm glad you put me at the end. I'm glad there was an extra time.
Absolutely.
So we should send you off to the men's room, and and we should send me off to do my research. Keith, it's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Where can people buy your book?
Well, the book again is Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me. Search for Soul in the Power Pits of Rock and Roll, and it is about the hunt for the gods within. And you can get it on Amazon, or you can get it at BarnesandNoble.com. The two of those are the easiest way. If you have a local bookstore, you can look for it there. But the easiest thing to do is Amazon.
Everybody loves Amazon now.
Yeah, I do too. It saves my life.
Right?
So hopefully I'll see you again.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime.
Okay, and have a wonderful night.
Absolutely.
And thank you for giving me all this time, and I'll see you soon.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, man. It's been an honor.
Okay, thanks, Keith.
Have a good one. Thanks a lot.
Have a good night.
You too.
So that was Howard Bloom. Listen to those stories, man. 2 hours worth of stories, and he's just getting started. He hasn't even touched on half the people that he got to work with and represent. So I'm sure he will be back, and we will talk even more about some of your other favorite musicians that he got the chance to work alongside. But what a guy. He was fascinating, and there's just so much to the stories that he's a brilliant mind, you know. He's a genius, and in business and in every other aspect. So he was really cool to talk to, and I look forward to having him back. I hope you guys dug it, man. I know it was a long one, but there was just so much to take in and unpackage that we needed the time. And sometimes you get a fascinating guest, you just lose all track of time. I hope you enjoyed that show as much as I did. I'll catch your asses later, man, and thanks again for the support.